we need to understand everything I have came from God.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because God is kind, because God is generous. He gives freely, and we need to be thankful, and we need to treat others the way He has treated us.
Welcome back, listeners, to Season 3 of Car Seat Questions podcast. Today, we are joined by Dr. Gregg Quiggle, and we're going to be talking about generosity. Dr. Quiggle, would you please tell listeners a little bit about yourself and about what you do?
Yes, I have recently, as of last June, left Moody. I am quasi-retired. I think that's the way to put it. I was at Moody for 36 and a half years. I was the D.L. Moody Professor of Historical Theology. And the last 20, I was also the Dean of Study Abroad. I'm married. My wife's name is Mary. We have 2 children. We have a boy, William, who lives in Wilmington, North Carolina, and a daughter, Emily, who lives in Lisle, Illinois, and they are no longer school age. Let's put it that way. So what I'm doing now is I try to find speaking gigs. And I'm also doing some Christian touring. I've got a little tour company, and coming up in May, we're going to do a London and Oxford tour with a guy named Jerry Root. Some of your listeners may know Jerry. We're doing a C.S. Lewis, Dwight Moody, Spurgeon tour in London and Oxford. We still got spots if anybody'd like to go.
And it's my understanding you also are writing a book or have written a book
Yes,
with Moody.
I have a book on Mr. Moody coming out. I believe it's May. There's a whole life of Mr. Moody that many people who are connected to Moody don't know anything about. He was actually from Massachusetts, and for example, he was involved in the Civil War, went to the front 9 times, started 4 other schools. One was in Glasgow, Scotland, and then there were 3 that were started in Northfield, Massachusetts. And those 3 in Massachusetts, there's been a closure and a merger, so there's 1 left there.
Okay. I didn't know about that one in Scotland. That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, for our listeners, if you're not joining us on YouTube, you see 2 tiny babies. We had some babysitter issues, so we're joined by our kids today. But what's a parenting podcast without children?
Yeah, we'll call Season 3 Unfiltered.
Oh, yeah. But today we want to talk about generosity with you. And
we're starting to see, I guess, these ideas of generosity with Trey. And so how can we see this idea of generosity play itself out in children's relationships with one another?
So usually the way that first comes out is when they are either with a brother or a sister or a friend, if they're an only child. And it usually works out something like this. They have something that their friend or brother or sister would like. And so the issue becomes, am I willing to share? And sometimes they share and sometimes they don't, and the Bible talks about us having something in us that causes us at times to be really selfish.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the earliest place where we get to see this. Children can be unbelievably generous and unbelievably selfish from moment to moment. It's stunning, but it reflects kind of who we are.
Yeah, it was interesting because before Ellis was even born, we were beginning to explain to Trey that he's going to have a sibling and there's going to be someone else here with us. And one of the first things that he told us was, are they going to snatch my toys?
Yep.
And we were like, well, maybe. But, mom and dad are going to be here to help you and to share and things like that. And even now, I mean, it's really interesting to see Trey, things that he's probably not even playing with. He just kind of like hoards them for himself. But then there are times where he's just like giving all his toys, to the baby brother. I'm just like, man, you just flipped the switch from
Yeah.
from one time to another, and it's pretty remarkable to see.
Yeah. Well, I think, I don't want to use a lot of big fancy theological terms here, but the Bible does talk about us being born with um, something that is fundamentally, if I can use the word, a little twisted. And so we, by nature, tend to think about ourselves first. And we see that in children.
So, if there's anything, how does learning as a child have to do with how does learning how to share as a child have anything to do with learning to be generous, right, in the future as an adult?
Yeah, I think there's two answers to that question. One has to do with um, what is sometimes simply referred to as virtues and vices. And virtues are and vices are both habits. It's habitually doing the right thing or habitually doing the wrong thing.
Right.
And so, to the extent that we can encourage our children to behave rightly and build that as a pattern into their life, I think that has long-term ramifications for the kind of person they are likely to become. Having said that, there's also a spiritual dynamic to this. And I think this is part of what um, Christianity is about, that we learn that we are to be givers rather than takers,
Mm-hmm.
and that we are to live our lives with our hands open rather than our fists clenched. But I think a lot of that's the work of God the Holy Spirit. This is not something that we do naturally.
Mm.
We can train ourselves to be generous, and we may even be generous externally. The problem is we know what's going on inside when we're being generous, and that you can be generous through clenched teeth.
Mm.
And that is not the kind of generosity that ultimately God would like us to have towards each other.
Yeah. So I know generosity goes a little bit further than just like giving things of like monetary value, right? So like how do we model generosity in simple ways to begin to I guess model or show that to our children, right? That again, that doesn't start with money, because at
Right.
such a young age they don't really understand the idea of money yet.
Well, to the extent that mom and dad are generous with each other,
Mm.
that shows up, number one. Number two, um, simple things like patience
Yeah.
and taking time when you're in the middle of something and the child comes and says, to the extent that it's reasonable to do so, stopping and giving them your attention. I think those are important things. Another idea we can throw in here, dinner time. Who gets served first? Are we respectful to each other? How do we divide the food up? How do we talk to each other? I think those are practical things. Somebody once said, it was probably me, in fact, about Mr. Moody. Mr. Moody's theology was caught rather than taught. And what I meant by that is he learned by observing.
Mm.
And I think children learn by observing. And so when they see us be generous, I think that is what educators sometimes call a hidden curriculum. You're teaching things without saying anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's an important thing for us to remember.
Yeah, that's good. How can we explain that even as generous as we are, our generosity is different than God's generosity? What does God's generosity look like?
The difference is God's generosity is, first, he doesn't owe it to anybody.
Mm.
We understand that we are dependent on others.
Mm-hmm.
we understand that others have been kind to us.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, if I can use a kind of big word, reciprocating sort of activity.
Yeah.
God doesn't owe us anything. And God never gives thinking about, I'll get it back someday.
Yeah.
Sometimes we're generous because we believe if we're generous, well, they'll be generous back. God doesn't operate that way.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't give out of ultimately what is kind of a selfish desire. I want to be treated generously, so I'll treat you generously.
Mm-hmm.
That's not how God operates.
Yeah.
God is not driven by what's in it for him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a huge difference.
Yeah, and he's not doing it because someone was nice to him first.
That's correct.
It's not like a pay it forward.
That's right. Or I'm going to get paid back.
Yeah.
He owes no one anything. He doesn't need anything from
Mhm.
somebody else. So his generosity is completely and totally a function of his character, who he is.
And he can't not be who he is.
That's correct.
Yeah. What can our forgiveness and grace through Jesus teach us about generosity?
Well, I think grace is kind of the essence of generosity in a divine sense, because, the old definition, grace is unmerited favor. That's giving something you do not deserve, you have not earned.
Mm-hmm.
And God forgives. And God forgives in ways that we don't.
Yeah.
We forgive, but we don't forget. And that's not the way God operates. He genuinely forgives us. He knows what we're like, and he forgives us anyway. He knows we're likely to do, if not the same thing, something very similar,
Right.
maybe seconds after we've asked forgiveness for what we've just done.
Yeah.
But he forgives us anyway. Now, that forgiveness is contingent in this sense. That is, God forgives us if we ask him to, if we are his child, if we have a relationship with him, then his attitude towards us is one of forgiveness.
Mm-hmm. There's so many nonprofits to give to, or people who are homeless on the streets that we could see that we can give to, and we can't give to everybody all the time. And so how do we, as parents, live out being generous in our day-to-day life and show our kids that we can be generous even if that means we're not giving money or food or something to everybody that we see?
Yeah, there's a couple things there. One is there was a theologian named Martin Luther, lived in Germany in the past, and he used to talk about Jesus' death on the cross as not only being a means for forgiveness, but a model for living.
Mm.
And my friend Jerry Root, who I mentioned before, I've heard Jerry say this multiple times: my life for yours, my life for yours, my life for yours. Now, that does not mean that we're to be foolish. And I was teaching a Sunday school class here a couple weeks ago, and a gentleman asked about this, and he said, well, look, are you telling me that we should functionally run around in just our skivvies because there's people everywhere, you could give it all away?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's what the Lord requires of us. I think he requires of us that we be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. So we need to be thoughtful. There's no virtue in wantonly giving our money away without finding out who these people are and what they do with our money.
Mm.
One. The other thing here is, I think it's important that we recognize that we're not God.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot save the world. God does not expect us to individually stop world hunger.
Yeah.
or injustice. That doesn't mean that we can't be generous in the context in which God places us. So I think, practically, I would give first and foremost to my local church, because I think that's where God has fundamentally established his work on earth. Jesus said, I will build my church. He didn't say, I will build my parachurch organization. That doesn't mean I'm against parachurch organizations. I work for one.
Right.
There's no mandate in Scripture for Bible colleges. But that doesn't mean I don't think they're a good thing and shouldn't be supported, but not in lieu of your own local church. And you can have impact on how your local church spends its money. What does it spend it on? You can be careful about that and ask questions, respectful questions. So I would say those are some of the kind of things. Practically, I served with a man on an elders board at my home church, and he told a story about when he was a kid. His father was a laborer of some kind, worked in a shop or something. It doesn't really matter, but got paid in cash. And he'd come home, and in front of the family, he'd go through and he took 10% and took that money out and put it in the Bible. That was going to church. The whole family saw that every single paycheck. Those dollars went into the Bible, and the next Sunday they were going to be in the church. Well, that marked that man. As a child, he saw his father do that. He had priorities and generosities about things that drove the way he managed his money, and it taught his family something about what it meant to be a follower of Christ.
Yeah, and did it in front of his family and
in front of his family. Yeah. I think we forget as parents the power of those kinds of things. They mark us.
What do you think is one thing, maybe two things, that you would want kids to know about generosity?
That the reason that we are to be generous is because that is what God is like, and because God has been generous to us.
Mm-hmm.
How many things do I have as a little boy or a little girl that I didn't earn? How many things were given to me? Am I thankful for the things that were given to me? And am I willing to share those things? And we need to remember that all these things that we think are ours are ultimately God's. And we are given the opportunity to enjoy them, and we're not to be foolish, but we need to understand everything I have came from God. Why? Because God is kind, because God is generous. He gives freely, and we need to be thankful, and we need to treat others the way he has treated us. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. That's still a pretty good word of advice.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Quiggle, for being with us today and allowing our kids to join us.
And my
Eat
dog.
snacks. Yes, Olive and the kids joining us today. And thank you to our listener for joining us today as well. Be sure to subscribe and follow us in wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a review. Leave a 5-star review for Snacks, for Olive, and for our 2 sons. 5 stars only.
Hey, what about 5 for me?
And 5 for Dr. Quiggle, of course. 5 for Dr. Quiggle too. Before we leave, do you want to give a plug for your tour this summer, you said?
Sure. We're doing London and Oxford. And it's focusing on the lives and works of Dwight Moody, Charles Spurgeon, and C.S. Lewis. And it's from May 10 to May 19. That's May 10 to May 19. The simplest way is just to send me an email. My email is ranch, RANCH 812 at hotmail.com. And we'd love to have you. We're going to try to keep it small. One of the things that makes us a little different is a lot of these tours, they want you going 12 hours a day. We don't operate that way. We try to do a half a day, 3/4 of a day at the most, and the rest of the time is yours. You should have the opportunity to do touristy things and shop or whatever it is you want to do. We'll be there to help you. But so it'll be myself and Jerry. And if we get enough people, I think Michael McDuffie's coming too.
Oh, nice.
Oh.
That'll be a treat.
Yeah. Kind of three blind mice when it comes to logistics. But we do kind of know what we're talking about most of the time.
You do.
But yeah.
Yeah,
Lauren's done some things with me. So
Yeah,
she
that's right.
knows.
We did a Europe
Yeah.
one. That was awesome.
Yeah, I think till this day, some of my friends who took a class with McDuffie, we still say his one-liners.
Oh, just.
Till this day, they
Yep.
they stick with you. So
Hubcaps and horseradishes. Just another bass swimming through the weeds. I was not gifted with that Irish sense of poetry.
Thanks so much for being with us. We'll put all that information in our show notes as well so people can
Thank you.
find that and find you if needed. Before we close, Eddie'd like to close us in a benediction.
yeah, so if you please join us in that. To him who is able to do far more than we can understand, may he grant us the wisdom to instruct our children to first love God above all else and to love one another as themselves. Go in peace. Thanks for joining us this week on the Car Seat Questions podcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, and comment, and just let us know what you thought.
Be sure to follow us on YouTube, wherever you find your podcasts, Instagram, TikTok, basically anywhere, and drop your comments below about what you thought about the episode.